Joining us now live to talk about the IS threat is Douglas Smith. He's a former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Welcome back to the broadcast, and thank you. Those pictures are so alarming. That many people flooding there to the border. Here in Washington, D.C. this week, making news was a congressional committee that was flanked with three pretty important people talking about the threat between IS and Al-Qaeda, and that they seem to be sort of trying to decide who's stronger and who's a bigger threat. How is this playing out?
Look, I think it's a big deal. The reality is that Al-Qaeda for so long dominated in the world of terrorism. They were the terror king, if you will. And now there's a new kid on the block, sort of the Y generation, if you will, who are trying to undermine all that Al-Qaeda did. Al-Qaeda was all about long-term planning, long-term plots. What happened at the World Trade Center took years to plan. Whereas ISIS is much more interested in headlines, severing heads, doing what they need to take, declaring their state in Iraq and Syria. And I think with that, the two groups are fighting for supremacy. Almost back in February, Al-Qaeda disowned, if you will. ISIS said, back off. They thought they'd put them in a box, if you will. ISIS has shown that they're not going to be put in that box. They're going to continue to strengthen and push themselves. They're taking greater advantage of foreign fighters, all of which is why I think we saw this escalation in the testimony this week on Capitol Hill.
Right, and also the trio of advisors, U.S. government officials, saying that an attack on the United States could be very possible and likely as they sort of battle it out to show who is the bigger force. Do you believe that's a real threat?
I think the threat hasn't gone away since 9/11. Do I think it's imminent? No. What I think they're trying to say and what they're trying to telegraph is, look, be aware. We need to pay attention to this. This is a scary thing. The fact that there's so many Western foreign fighters that have flocked to ISIS is of great concern. We've seen the Australians be worried, the British be worried, and I think what they're doing is saying, everyone, we need to pay attention to this. Don't run for the hills, but pay attention to this.
From your experience, how would these two groups compete against one another to show that the other is the stronger force? Is that with bragging rights for the biggest terrorist act? Is it money?
I think the biggest terrorist act. I mean, when Al-Qaeda was successful in 9/11, that changed the world. It changed the world the way they wanted to, and what they wanted is they wanted to see Western powers spend tens of millions of dollars having to beef up security. For them, it's always been about the economic terrorism they could bring about on Western powers. I think what ISIS is trying to do is just straight terror.
I see. And so Al-Qaeda and IS were originally united in Iraq. Why did they split? Do we know?
I think the biggest reason is that ISIS was trying to go too far. Al-Qaeda has always wanted an Islamic State, but they were much more plotty in the way they wanted to get there. ISIS got impatient. They did not want to wait. They're the Y generation. They want it all right now, whereas Al-Qaeda was willing to work for it. And when ISIS wouldn't take out the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda's direction, Al-Qaeda pushed them out. And I also think that the horror of what they were doing was even too much for Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, there were reports of that. So the Islamic State put out this Hollywood-style trailer this week of showing, what it could actually do to the U.S. if it attacked the White House. It was on YouTube. It's now down. They're very good at social media, this group. They've used social media to their advantage. Is this something you've ever seen before? I mean, these kind of threats, propaganda in video?
Well, propaganda, and this has been going on since World War II and before. Al-Qaeda started it with Inspire magazine. I think these guys took it to a whole new level. But I think part of it is anybody with a new computer with some good editing software sitting at home can edit one of these videos. I think the real worry is, can they act on what these videos are all about? The fact that they're putting them out there just shows they're younger, they're more involved, they're using new technologies. The real concern is, can they act on what they are swearing they will do?
And we have to ask a sitting former Homeland Security official about the two attempts to get inside the White House this past week. How does this security breach happen in this modern day area, especially post 9/11?
Right, look, I think it's a little scary. I think the Secret Service will be taking a deep, hard look at what happened. That being said, I think they did what they needed to do. And I think if the president had actually been sitting in the Oval Office, we would have seen a very different scenario play out than the president being a little further away from the threat. I think the Secret Service were measured in their approach. Are they going to go back and look, how could this gotten so far? Absolutely. But I do think that what they did is measured in what the response was.
I see. Okay, and back to IS, one other question. Do you think these three top U.S. Officials on Capitol Hill here in Washington this week were laying the groundwork for possible ground troops by going to Congress and telling them about the possible threats against the U.S.?
I don't really think so. I think General Dempsey was more talking about the overall process and laying it all out. I mean, they're all very cognizant of an American public that is unbelievably war-weary. And the notion of the president going on TV one day and saying, hey, guys, we're sending 100,000 troops into theater, I believe is unbelievably unrealistic. I think they were just walking through a process and explaining it. Will there be advisors? I'm sure they'll need the advisors. But I just don't see the American public supporting sending 100,000 or more troops onto the ground.
Alrighty, Douglas Smith, thank you as always. We appreciate it.